I speak of Africa and golden joys, the joy of wandering through lonely lands, the joy of hunting the mighty and terrible lords of the wilderness, the cunning, the wary, and the grim. The land teems with beasts of the chase, infinite in number and incredible in variety. It holds the fiercest beasts of raven and the fleetest and most timid of those things that live in undying fear of talon and fang. These things can be told, but there are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness. Well, that's what Theodore Roosevelt had to say about hunting in Africa. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I am here today at the James Julia Auction House up in Maine. And what I'm taking a look at is probably a larger assembly of 4-bore rifles than most people will ever see in any place at one time. I have 4 here in front of me, and there's several more that aren't on camera right now. These are all coming up for sale in the Julia March of 2016 auction. And I was definitely not going to miss out on this chance to take a look at these guns and share them with you. This is totally alien to today's firearms world. Nobody builds guns like this anymore except on a very small custom basis. And this used to be a recognized element of hunting. So I want to begin with a little bit of terminology and a little bit of background. Most of these guns here on the table were in fact made by Holland Holland. They are probably the best known of the bespoke British gun makers. Holland Holland has been around since the early 1800s, manufacturing custom, very high-end, extraordinarily high-quality firearms. Their production and quality really declined probably in the 1970s, 80s, as this sort of firearm fell out of favor. Not just the 4-bore, the massive rifles, but the idea of bespoke, custom, very elegant, high-end rifles, in particular, fell out of favor with a lot of the European affluent. However, back in the day, so to speak, Holland Holland was probably the best of the companies that you could have a gun made by. And the purpose of a gun like a 4-bore, because you don't need a 4-bore to go on safari. Everyone, well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people have probably heard of one of the famous elephant hunters who used a 6.5 cartridge, basically a little small bore rifle, and killed an extraordinary number of elephants with it. For even a proper high-end, dangerous game safari rifle, something like this would be perfectly sufficient. This is a 465 500 double rifle. This was actually made for a Maharaja in India by Holland Holland. This was the standard dangerous game rifle of the time. And it looks to anyone like, I mean, it's a fantastically made and gorgeously engraved gun, but it is a typical rifle. You look at this and you pick it up and, wow, 465, that's a pretty big rifle. I bet this kicks like a beast. I bet it does. But then you get some perspective on a gun like this. These guys weigh about 20 pounds. They are double-barreled, 4-bore rifled. Something like a 465 will do the job. Why do you need a 4-bore? What was the point? Well, 2 things. First off, the 4-bore rifles came up, and others like them, 6 bores, 8 bores. These came about before the invention of smokeless powder. And at that time, if you're just using black powder, you really have a limit on the velocity of a projectile. You can't just make a small bore projectile go faster and faster with black powder. It doesn't work. You get a maximum pressure and diminishing returns. Now, when smokeless powder was invented, all of a sudden you could drive jacketed small bore cartridges or projectiles much, much faster. And that's where something like that 465 gets its stopping powers from velocity. Before that, if you wanted more stopping power, you needed more projectile. And that led to guns getting bigger and bigger and bigger, ultimately to the 4-bore rifle. There were 2-bore rifles made, really not practical. The 4-bore was the standard recognized largest game rifle made and used. So a quick note about the word bore or gauge, this applies to both. What that term is actually telling you, when that number is telling you, when you see 4-bore or 12 gauge, is if you take a pound of lead and you divide it into that many perfect spheres, the resulting diameter is your unit of measurement. So, for example, 12 gauge is about 72 caliber, if I remember properly. And that's the diameter of a perfect sphere of lead that's 1/12 of a pound. So a 4-bore uses a perfectly round spherical ball that is 1/4 of a pound. That's what this dimensional measurement means. So in practical terms, in application, a 4-bore is about a 1-inch in diameter barrel. It is freaking massive. Bullet weight for a spherical 4-bore projectile is about 1,750 grains. That's 4 ounces, a 1/4 pound. Loads for these rifles, because again, these were intended for the most dangerous and the biggest game. They were intended as, often you'll find them referred to as stopping rifles. You would carry one of these for when you got charged by something really huge and really angry. A charging rhinoceros, a charging elephant, tiger, lion. These are the animals and the situations that the 4-bore rifles were intended for. Because at that range, you've got one shot, and it had better work, and work very, very fast. And with black powder, you do that by getting a really big projectile, a 1/4 pound freaking bullet. So the loadings of these ranged from 12 dram up to 16 dram. Now that's in shotgun terminology. A light load for one of these would be about 325 grains of black powder, and it would go up from there. In fact, it's interesting. These are rifles. Everyone's familiar with the concept of rifling. The rifles were actually less popular than smoothbore guns. So a little terminology note here for this type of firearm, the very fine British-style double guns. A rifle is rifled, a gun is smoothbore. So you do not have 4-bore guns, you have 4-gauge guns. So interestingly, smoothbore 4-gauge shotguns, or not shotguns, but guns, you'd call them, were actually more popular than the 4-bore rifles. And there's good reason for this. These were intended to be used at close range. You're talking often 50 feet or less, maybe as much as 50 yards. A smoothbore at 50 yards is going to be totally sufficiently accurate for the game hunting that these were used for. And then a smoothbore has a couple of advantages to it, particularly in the days of black powder. When you were dealing with muzzleloaders, because of course this concept predates the cartridge. These were made as muzzleloaders. In fact, this is a muzzleloader here. If you have a smoothbore, it's a lot easier and faster to load it because you're not trying to press a soft lead projectile onto rifling. You're just stuffing it down a smoothbore. Smoothbores will tend to foul less because you don't have the rifling to catch and hold black powder fouling. And the smoothbore guns actually recoil less as well because there's less resistance to that projectile leaving the bore. So for these reasons, the smoothbore guns actually tended to be more popular than the 4-bore rifles, although they don't have the gravitas of the 4-bore rifles. Now, you might be wondering, if you've got this monstrous of a cartridge, why would you need 2? Why not just 1? Well, the answer again goes back to the fact that these were intended for the most dangerous of game. And if you've got even a repeating rifle has a chance of malfunctioning. With a double-barreled rifle, a double rifle, you've got 2 completely independent guns in one device, in one stock. You've got 2 triggers, 2 hammers, 2 firing pins, 2 cartridges. If you have a misfire, you immediately have a second round at your disposal to use. And if you've got an angry bull elephant charging at you, that's a very reassuring thing to have. There are a number of professional hunters who used these after having incidents with repeating rifles not working. Now, they did make 4-bore cartridges using nitro smokeless powder in the later days of their use. I'm going to ignore that for the time being. Most of these classic guns are intended for black powder. With black powder, you would have, as I said, about a 1,750 grain round ball. You can also fire shaped projectiles, which can be typically a little bit heavier. You'd be firing that over a charge of probably not less than 300 or 325 grains of black powder. That's going to give you a muzzle velocity of about 1,330, 1,340 feet per second, which equates to about 7,000 pounds of muzzle energy. To put that in perspective, a 12-gauge slug has about 2,600 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So you're talking close to 3 times the recoil of a 12-gauge slug. Now, Now, to balance that out, to accommodate that a bit, you have, these are obviously quite heavy guns. The lightest you'll find these would probably be about 18 pounds, and they're going to go up from there. A single-barreled gun would be, well, maybe 16 to 18 pounds. The double-barreled guns are typically going to be around 20, potentially as much as 24 pounds. A lot of this depends on barrel length. A lot of these guns typically have fairly short barrels because, well, frankly, because if you made them long, they would just be too heavy to be practical to carry and use. Now, there are a couple of these guns that I want to mention specifically and give you a little bit of detail on. First one up is this guy. This is probably the nicest one here. This is actually one of a pair of guns that came out of the Holland Holland reference collection a couple decades ago. When the company was in financial trouble, they started selling some of their very nice collection guns simply to meet payroll and operating expenses because their guns weren't, people weren't buying very high-end bespoke firearms. So they had to do this to stay liquid as a company. The number one of this pair is still in the Holland Holland collection. The number two here is obviously coming up for sale. This is what's called a Jones underlever. So that refers to the fact that to open the gun, you take this lever here and pivot it open. I'll demonstrate that on a different gun in a minute. Hammered, 4-bore, rifled, gorgeous, gorgeous gun. We also have here these two. These are a pair. They were made specifically for the Nizam of Hyderabad. How's that for a formal sounding title? He was the ruler of the state of Hyderabad in India. This is a pretty large state, pretty much right in the middle of India, right in the center. Hyderabad was, in particular, a few things, a lot of the Indian states were basically self-contained principalities for a long time. Hyderabad in particular was a staunch supporter of the British during the Indian Mutiny, or the First Indian War of Independence, which gained them a lot of favor with British royalty. The Nizam, the ruler, was at this point an avid sportsman or hunter, and had quite a large number of firearms, including some absolutely gorgeous pieces like these two. They're actually being sold as a pair, which is a bit unusual. They both have cases. All of these guns come with original cases and accoutrements and extra stuff. I'll show you some of that as well. Just, really impressive set of gear with these guns. These two are also, of course, both 4-bores. Their bores are slightly smaller. I believe they are 0.96 inch on the lands. And the shorter one is 20 pounds 8 ounces. The longer one is 20 pounds 14 ounces, so close in weight there as well. Both also Jones underlever guns. Now, Rada was a reseller, a commercial sales agent, you might say. They sold a lot of things, including extremely high-end guns, but they didn't make the guns themselves. These guns, based on the serial numbers, are most likely made by W.C. Scott, and probably in 1875. That's what the serial numbers would mesh with. So that gives you some vintage and some provenance on these two. So this one, the last of the guns I have up on the table right now, is substantially different. This is actually a muzzleloading 4-bore, which is what you would have used before the cartridges were readily available, or after if you preferred that sort of thing. Also 4-bore. However, instead of typical, what we would recognize as normal rifling, it's actually designed for a winged bullet. So picture a bullet that has a lobe, two lobes, 180 degrees apart. The idea there was you would actually cast those lobes into the projectile, and then when you go to load it, you are trying to get the best of both worlds. You get, you're not forcing the bullet into a lot of sharp lands and grooves like you would on a rifle, so it makes this easier to load. A little bit lighter recoil, less friction working on the bullet when it fires. However, those lobes are turning, and so you are getting a rifling effect and the increase in accuracy. That was the goal of winged bullets, and this is a winged bullet rifle. It's also, interestingly, one that has a double set trigger to it. Right, now there is one other rifle that I want to show you because it's kind of the opposite at the other end of the spectrum of 4-bores than these. These are investment guns. I mean, there's no reason you can't shoot them. They're proofed. They're fantastically made guns, but I suspect most of the people who own this sort of thing probably aren't going to go out and shoot it regularly. Maybe once or twice, but not every day. They're very valuable. You don't want to damage them, that sort of thing. However, there is also here a 4-bore rifle that is built on an original English action, but something, I don't know what, happened to the stock and barrel, and they've been replaced with modern replacements. That is eminently a shootable gun. It comes with a number of brass cases. You'll notice I mentioned that the bore diameters are different on these guns. All 4-bore rifles are going to be different. They're all going to require custom-made brass cases to use because they're not going to be interchangeable. Well, this rifle that I want to show you next has a bunch of cases with it, and it is a shooter's gun rather than an investment-grade gun. All right, we need to truly appreciate the size and monstrosity of the 4-bore. So, we'll start with a 22 long rifle, typical cartridge, everyone's seen those. 9mm, parabellum, again, pretty typical. Let's move up to something considered significant. That is a 4570. 4570 is a pretty stompy cartridge. A lot of energy, and you want to know how to shoot a gun well to shoot a 4570 effectively, especially a light one. And actually about the same length, a 12 gauge. Also, 12 gauge slugs, that's got recoil, no doubt about that. There's a 4-bore round. These things are just huge. It's a 4 to 4.5 inch long case, and as I mentioned, a 1/4 pound bullet. Hopefully this puts things in proper perspective. Here's a box of 10, which, by the way, is also up for sale in this auction. Damn. All right, hopefully this gets across just the concept of how big this gun is. This is truly the biggest shoulder-fired rifle ever made. Certainly the biggest, let me put it this way, the biggest shoulder-fired rifle actually used by people on a regular basis for serious purposes other than simply trying to one-up a nominal record for biggest rifle ever. People use this stuff for real and regularly. All right, so here's our shooter 4-bore. This is, again, a Jones underlever, which I'll show you in a moment. We do not know who exactly made it. It is marked, it's difficult to make out in the case hardening. It's marked Army-Navy Supply right here, which was a significant, they were a retailer of many things, including both military and sporting firearms. It's not uncommon to find British Webley revolvers marked Army-Navy Supply. British officers were responsible for providing their own sidearms, and Army-Navy Supply was one common source for them. And of course, if you're stationed in India and you'd like to get yourself an elephant rifle, Army-Navy Supply can supply you with one like this. Now, the barrel, you can obviously tell here, this is not the same as the highly decorated sorts of original barrels that you'll often find on these guns. This is modern. This was made by J.J. Peridot out of Enid, Oklahoma. And, well, let's get right to it here. We've got an underlever that pulls out to the side, like this, at which point the action breaks open. You have an extractor here, but these do not have ejectors here. You are not speed shooting this thing. We have an extractor there, and a rather large locking underlug. When you close the gun, there are a couple little catches here on the bottom of the trigger guard. Lever snaps home like that. Cock the hammer, and you're ready to fire. This is a spring-loaded firing pin right there. Trigger on this is actually rather light and nice. It's not particularly heavy. This gun is set up with, again, a modern manufacturer stock. The stock also came from Peridot. This gun has a modern stock and a modern rubber recoil pad on it as well. The recoil pads you will find on some of the original traditional guns as well, because there is no shame in having a recoil pad on a rifle like this, that's for sure. So still a gorgeous gun, nice cheek rest on this side, but this is not the antiquarian put it in the cabinet and admire it from afar sort of rifle. This is for someone who actually wants to go out and shoot a 4-bore. And speaking of that, I know someone who wants to go shoot a 4-bore. I want to go shoot a 4-bore. Since this came with some cases specifically for it, and with the very generous permission of the consignor, we're going to take this thing out and put a round, maybe two, we'll see, through it and see what is it really like to shoot a 4-bore. We have a 1750 grain projectile in here, over 325 grains of black powder. That is approximately a 12 dram load, which is approximately the light factory load for one of these. So, drop that in there, crank it shut. Whew. This is going to be an experience. Woo! That was some pretty good smoke and fire.
How was that?
Empty round. So, I'll be honest, guys, that was not nearly as bad as I was afraid it might be. That moves you pretty good. It's a pretty darn good kick, but with black powder, I can see someone having a lot of fun with something like that. This thing was so much fun that we're going to do a second shot with it. So, have a second hand-loaded projectile. We will very gently load that in, chamber it up, block that nice and tight, and we'll fire it left-handed this time. I shot it right-handed the first time because I figured if it actually physically injured me, I wanted it to be my right shoulder, not my good left shoulder. So, here we go. You ready? Woo! Ha-ha! That one was a little stouter, I think, or I wasn't holding it quite as tight. Woo! That is a sport. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I would like to conclude by pointing out that my shoulder is, in fact, intact and okay. Not dislocated, not broken. In fact, not really even bruised, I don't think. We'll see if anything develops over the next day or two. But it's been a fantastic opportunity to take a look at a selection of guns all in one place that you'll almost certainly never see together again. So this is, of course, an auction house, and all of these guns are coming up for sale in March. And if you would like to have any one of them or several of them for yourself, go ahead and take a look in the links in the description text below. Those will take you to the catalog pages for all these guns, where you can see the Julia Company photographs and their descriptions and their provenances, everything from the muzzleloaders like this one, which there are several more of in the catalog, to a absolutely exemplary idea of the Holland Holland high-end 4-bore, possibly the best, probably the best one anyone will be able to buy for several decades, to something that has a modern barrel on it that you can actually go out and shoot without concern about destroying an antique or damaging an antique. Whatever your taste in 4-bores is, there's probably something here to satisfy it. So take a look. Best of luck to you, and thanks for watching.